outshine an entire galaxy. But why won't our sun have a spectacular fireworks display upon its death? That's what one viewer wanted to ask the universe. So, Leroy G. from Newport, Rhode Island texted us, why won't our sun go supernova when it dies?
Leroy, I'm sure glad the sun won't explode as a supernova. There's two reasons. First, the sun isn't massive enough to explode on its own. Stars have to be 8 or 10 times the mass of the sun to explode on their own. And second, the sun doesn't have a companion star from which it could steal material, grow in mass, and eventually become unstable and explode.
At the last stage of our sun's life, its outer atmosphere, a glowing sphere of gas called a planetary nebula, will have drifted away. All that will remain of our once powerful star will be a glowing white-hot cinder called a white dwarf.
It'll be about the size of the Earth at that point, and it'll have about half of its mass remaining. That object still has as much thermal energy as the entire sun did, but it's very small and doesn't radiate it very effectively.
White dwarfs are small, but extremely dense. Imagine our white dwarf sun as small as the Earth, but with the same mass as a whole star.
If you were to take a chunk of white dwarf material the same size as the cell phone, it would weigh approximately the same as an elephant. So it's very dense material, although this white dwarf size is very small relative to the sun as we know it today.
As a white dwarf, our sun will slip into retirement, using up its life savings of thermal energy for billions, even trillions of years.
When it has become a white dwarf, it'll be like a car that's coasting. It's run out of gas, but it's still moving because it has energy of motion that's propelling it forward. It's not generating any new energy by burning fuel. It'll be radiating away the stored energy in its hot interior, energy that it had generated through nuclear reactions when it was young and vibrant. So it's like a car that's just going along without any fuel until finally, eventually, very slowly, it comes to a halt.
Anything left in the solar system after that transition to the white dwarf stage would just gradually cool off. It would remain in orbit around the white dwarf. The orbital decay times are extremely long, and it would just stay there as a quiet, cold, orbiting body forever.
Our white dwarf sun will become progressively cooler and dimmer. Since it's no longer generating energy, everything in the solar system will begin to freeze. As the sun's vital signs continue to dim, what will be the forecast for Earth? In its death throes, our aging sun will become insufferably hot as a red giant, and then unbearably cold as a white dwarf. This could be the kiss of death for planet Earth as it moves from the frying pan and into the frost.
By the time the sun becomes a white dwarf, we can imagine that temperatures on Earth, depending on where it is in its orbit, would drop significantly fairly rapidly because the white dwarf is no longer producing energy through fusion. So it's not producing this energy to heat the Earth.
We'll be fried to a crisp if we remain where we are during the red giant stage. But in a similar vein, we will go into a deep freeze if we remain where we are when the sun becomes a white dwarf. Nevertheless, there will be some pockets where life could continue to survive. For example, in the liquid parts deep in the oceans, it could survive.
At the outset, humans could theoretically live in submarines near hot hydrothermal vents while they dredge up the geothermal energy from deep within the Earth's core. But after 1 million years, the oceans would completely freeze, and life would inevitably perish.
after the sun becomes a white dwarf, it's just going to cool and cool. It's very much like a pot on the stove. Once you turn off the burner, there's no more source of energy, and so it just gradually gets cooler and cooler and cooler. If the Earth manages to survive until the sun is only a white dwarf star, it will hardly be getting any energy at all. I can say with absolute certainty that if you stick around long enough, you could experience both death by fire and also death by ice.
Without energy from our sun, all remaining life in our solar system will disappear. However, this disaster could be preempted by accomplishing what so far has been impossible to do: actually duplicating the sun's hydrogen fusion right here on Earth. Science has already been able to manufacture nuclear fission, which involves the splitting of atoms into lighter, smaller nuclei. This is the power that drives our nuclear power plants and ignites nuclear weapons. But nuclear fusion, which occurs in the core of the sun, requires putting nuclei together to form a larger, heavier nucleus. And so far, this process has not been achieved here on Earth.
The problem with recreating the sun's conditions is essentially getting materials to the densities and temperatures that you have in the center of the sun. The sun has its gravity to drive the pressures and densities up so it can get these high reactions. On Earth, we don't have the luxury of using the sun's gravity, so we have to find other ways to try and compress the material and generate the kinds of densities that you see.
At the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Northern California, scientists are taking on the challenge by attempting to create a miniature man-made star. The experiment involves aiming the world's largest laser, the size of 3 football fields, at a BB-sized target filled with hydrogen fuel.
In an inertial confinement experiment like the one at Lawrence Livermore, you start with a small pellet, maybe a ½ inch across, the core of which is made of a solid material containing lots of hydrogen to undergo fusion, the outside of which has layers of different material that are engineered to produce a shock wave that will drive in and compress that core as much as possible.
The colossal laser will split into 192 separate beams that will strike the pellet housed inside a capsule. When the fuel pellet's shell is struck by these high-energy X-rays, it should implode and then ultimately produce nuclear fusion in its core.
If we had controlled, affordable nuclear fusion, it would change everything. Many things about our lives would change, but most importantly, we wouldn't need the sun anymore. We could produce energy, heat, light on demand. We could live anywhere in the cosmos with a supply of hydrogen and make our own energy. We could fly to other planets very quickly, in days instead of years. You can extract all the water you need from practically any material that contains hydrogen and oxygen. There isn't